He is just a soft human.
Polish and cold stone. That was the smell of the palace corridor at that hour. Beeswax polish worked into floors old enough to have absorbed 3 centuries of it. And underneath, the mineral chill of a building that had never once needed heating in its life, because its walls were thick enough to hold the cold in on purpose. Somewhere down the hall, a clock with gears the size of dinner plates ticked through the small hours of the night, with a patience that made the silence feel heavier rather than lighter. Nathaniel Cole stood outside a bedroom door he'd been assigned to guard for 6 weeks, in a uniform that had clearly been tailored for someone with different shoulders than his, and listened to 2 Kaelen royal guards discuss, in a language they assumed he couldn't follow well enough to catch the insult, exactly how long they expected him to last in the job. He'd followed it fine, he just hadn't seen much percentage in saying so. 6 weeks of being underestimated. Nathaniel Cole had been a private security contractor before the Kaelen court hired him. Not military, not law enforcement, just 11 years of close protection work for human executives and diplomats who could afford it. The kind of job that taught you to read a room faster than you could read a resume. He was 38, average height, unremarkable build by design, because a bodyguard who looked like a bodyguard had already failed at half his job before anything happened. He wore his hair short and practical, kept his hands calloused from range time rather than gym vanity, and carried himself with the kind of loose, watchful stillness that most people mistook at first glance for boredom. He'd been hired for this posting through a diplomatic contracting agency that placed human specialists with alien courts wealthy enough to want the novelty and pragmatic enough to want the actual competence that came with it. A small, quiet industry that had grown up in the years since first contact. Human private security firms discovering that certain skills translated remarkably well across species, because paranoia, threat assessment, and the willingness to put your own body between a client and a blade turned out to be universal disciplines. He had not expected the posting to be easy. He had expected, walking in, that the Kaelen Royal Guard, an elite, hereditary corps that had protected this particular throne for 11 generations, would resent an outsider being assigned anywhere near their princess. What he hadn't fully appreciated in his first weeks on the job was just how thoroughly they'd decided, collectively and without much debate, that he was a liability rather than a colleague. The Kaelen were tall, lean, fast-moving people with skin in shades of deep blue-green, and a court culture built almost entirely around martial pedigree. You did not become a royal guard in this palace without a bloodline stretching back generations and a personal combat record that had been tested publicly in ceremonial trials since childhood. Nathaniel had none of that. He had 11 years of quiet, competent, unglamorous work keeping soft targets alive, and a hiring memo from the Crown's own Foreign Office that the guard captain had made no secret of resenting. "He is an ornament," Captain Vesathren had said, in front of the assembled guard detail on Nathaniel's very first day, not quite loud enough to be a formal insult, and not quite quiet enough to be anything else. The Crown wishes to appear progressive to its human allies. He is decoration for a treaty photograph, nothing more. Treat him accordingly, which is to say, do not expect him to matter when it counts. Nathaniel had let that slide too. 6 weeks of sliding insults had taught him that the guard detail's contempt ran deep enough that arguing with it only entertained them further, and he decided early on that his actual job, the one nobody had bothered asking his opinion on before hiring him for it, was keeping Princess Elira Vantresh alive, not winning a popularity contest with men who'd already decided the outcome before he arrived. Princess Elira herself had been, if anything, more skeptical than her guards. She was 26, sharp-eyed, and carried the particular exhausted wariness of someone who had grown up being a target. 3 assassination attempts in the last decade alone, all against her late mother, all foiled by exactly the kind of hereditary guard corps that now sneered at Nathaniel in the hallways. She had not asked for a human bodyguard. Her father, the king, had insisted on it as part of a broader diplomatic gesture toward the human coalition, and she had accepted the arrangement with the flat, wordless tolerance of a woman used to having decisions about her own safety made without her input. "You do not need to prove anything to my guard," she told him, on his second day, catching him in a quiet hallway after another round of muttered contempt from a passing patrol. "They will believe what they believe regardless of what you do. I would advise you not to waste effort trying to change their minds." "Wasn't planning to," Nathaniel had said. "Just planning to keep you breathing. Their opinion of how I do that isn't really my problem." She'd studied him for a long moment after that, something unreadable behind her eyes, and hadn't said anything else. 6 weeks later, they still hadn't had much conversation beyond the operational necessities of his job, where she'd be, when, who she'd be meeting, what threats the palace's own intelligence office flagged as current. He'd cataloged her habits the way he cataloged every client's habits, which exits she favored, how she stood when she was nervous versus merely tired, the particular tell in her jaw when a court conversation was going somewhere she didn't like. He knew her better, after 6 weeks of professional observation, than most of the guards who'd grown up serving her family had ever bothered to learn. None of that mattered to Captain Thren, who continued, 6 weeks in, to treat Nathaniel's presence outside the princess's door as a mild, ongoing insult to the guard corps' professional pride. "He sleeps standing up like a pack animal," one of the 2 guards outside Elira's door was saying now, low, amused. In Kaelen he assumed Nathaniel's translator implant hadn't fully mastered. "I have watched him. 6 hours a shift and he does not so much as shift his weight." "He will not last the season," the other agreed. "The captain says the Foreign Office will quietly rotate him out once the treaty photographs are taken. A human cannot match our reflexes, cannot match our training. He is furniture with a pulse." Nathaniel, standing 3 meters away with his hands folded loosely in front of him, said nothing, and filed the exchange away with the same flat professional interest he filed away everything else that happened on his shift. Not because it didn't sting, a little, after 6 weeks of it, but because stinging was a luxury that came after the shift ended, not during it. He had no way of knowing, standing in that cold stone corridor at that hour, that the shift currently underway was about to become the only one that mattered. The first sign. It started small, the way these things usually did if you knew what to look for, and catastrophically if you didn't. Nathaniel had spent 11 years learning to read the small signs, and the first one arrived at just past 3 in the morning, when the palace's ambient hum, the distant drone of climate systems, the occasional footfall of a patrol 2 corridors over, dropped by a fraction he doubted anyone else on the floor would have consciously registered. A power fluctuation, brief, almost nothing, the kind of thing a palace's own maintenance staff would file as a routine grid variance and forget about by morning. Nathaniel had spent enough years working protection details to know that routine grid variances, 3 hours before dawn, in a wing of a palace holding the only heir to a contested throne, were the kind of thing that deserved a second look regardless of how routine they were supposed to be. "You felt that?" he asked the 2 guards, quiet, professional, no edge to it at all. The nearer guard, the one who'd called him furniture with a pulse not 10 minutes earlier, didn't bother hiding his contempt this time. "A power flicker. The palace is 3 centuries old. It happens weekly. I would not expect a hired outsider to know that, given how briefly you have served here. Copy that, Nathaniel said, and didn't argue further because arguing wasn't the job. He tapped the small comm bead at his collar instead, opening a quiet channel to the palace's own security office, and requested a status check on the wing's power grid. A request that got logged, acknowledged, and 20 minutes later returned with exactly the dismissive non-answer he'd half expected. Routine variance, no anomaly detected. Stand down. He didn't stand down. He didn't escalate it either, not yet, because 11 years of this work had also taught him the difference between a hunch worth acting on and a hunch worth simply staying a little more awake for. He shifted his weight for the first time in 6 hours, rolled his shoulders once, and settled back into stillness with his attention sharpened rather than relaxed. The second sign came 40 minutes later, and it was not subtle at all. The corridor's overhead lighting, without warning, dropped to a third of its normal output across the entire wing, and somewhere below them, muffled through several floors of old stone, came the unmistakable sound of a controlled explosion. No way out. The 2 Kaelen guards were moving before the echo of the blast had fully died, reflexes honed by generations of hereditary training, snapping them instantly into a defensive posture at the princess's door. And for one brief, professional moment, Nathaniel found himself genuinely impressed by how fast they'd gone from mockery to readiness. Whatever else was true about Captain Thren's Guard Corps, they hadn't lied about their training. Breach in the lower halls, the nearer guard said, comm bead already active, voice tight. Security grid confirms multiple hostile signatures, moving up through the service corridors. This was not a random attack. Someone disabled the lower wing's alarm relay before triggering the blast, the power fluctuation an hour ago. Told you it was worth a second look, Nathaniel said, already moving to the princess's door, already running the wing's layout through his head. The exits he'd cataloged on day 1 specifically for a scenario exactly like this. The choke points, the dead ends, the one service stair that connected this floor to the palace's old original wing, built before the current security architecture existed and consequently under-monitored by every modern sensor the palace's own intelligence office relied on. This is not the time, the guard snapped back, and keyed the door's override, moving inside to secure the princess with his partner a half-step behind him. Elira Vantresh was already awake, already on her feet, already reaching for a light robe with the flat, practiced calm of someone who had lived through this exact scenario more than once before in her 26 years. How many? She said, not a question so much as a demand for data. Security grid estimates 6 to 8 hostile signatures, the guard said. Elite equipment signatures. This is not a common uprising or a disorganized faction. This reads as professional. 6 to 8 against 3 guards and a locked door, Nathaniel said, doing the math out loud because saying it out loud helped him think through it faster. That's not a siege plan. That's an extraction plan or a kill plan, and either way they're not planning to sit outside and wait us out. They're coming up fast, and they picked tonight because your father's own council session tomorrow puts half the loyal guard rotation on the east wing instead of here. The guard's expression flickered, not quite surprise, but something close to it, the first crack in 6 weeks of dismissive certainty that the hired outsider didn't understand palace security architecture well enough to matter. How do you know the rotation schedule? Same way I know 6 exits off this floor in which 3 of them dead end, Nathaniel said. It's the job. Been doing it the whole 6 weeks you've been calling me furniture. There was no time to enjoy the moment, and Nathaniel didn't try to. The comm bead crackled with an update from the security office. The lower corridor's cameras had gone dark one by one as the intruders advanced, a professional, methodical blinding of the palace's own eyes that told him more about the attacker's competence than any equipment signature could have. Whoever these people were, they weren't opportunists. They'd planned this for longer than a single night. "We hold here," the senior guard said, already positioning himself between the door and the princess. "Reinforcements from the East Wing are 11 minutes out. We secure this room and wait." 11 minutes is a long time for a team professional enough to blind palace security on the way in, Nathaniel said. "If they've got the layout memorized as well as it looks like they do, they know this door's the obvious choke point too, which means they've got a plan for it that doesn't involve knocking politely. I'd rather not find out what that plan is from the wrong side of a locked door with no second option." "And you have a better one," the guard demanded, patience fraying under the weight of a scenario his training had prepared him for in theory, and never actually tested him against in 11 years of peaceful service. "Maybe," Nathaniel said, already moving toward the room's north wall, running his hand along a section of old paneling he'd cataloged, on his very first day purely out of professional habit, the kind of habit that made guards like Thren's men roll their eyes at him in the hallway, and the kind of habit that was about to matter more than anything else that had happened in 6 weeks. "This wing predates the current security retrofit. Older service passage behind this wall, sealed off when the palace modernized but never actually removed. I found it week 1. Nobody updated your maps to show it's still physically there, which means it's not on the attacker's floor plan either, if they're working off anything current." A fight in the dark. The princess's door held for 90 seconds against the first assault, long enough for Nathaniel to confirm what he already suspected, that the old service passage behind the north wall was indeed still intact, narrow, dust-thick, and entirely unmonitored by the palace's modern security grid. It bought them an option. It did not, on its own, buy them safety, because the moment the attackers breached door's outer lock, the fight that followed made brutally clear exactly how outmatched 3 defenders were against 6 professional, well-equipped assailants moving with the coordinated precision of a team that had clearly rehearsed this exact scenario more than once. Nathaniel took the first attacker through the doorway not with a weapon. He'd surrendered his sidearm at the threshold per palace protocol on his very first day, a decision Captain Thren's men had mocked at the time, and one Nathaniel had quietly, privately resented ever since. But with the doorframe itself, using the narrow choke point to turn a 6-against-3 fight into a series of 1-against-1 exchanges the same way the corridor's own architecture allowed. He drove an elbow into the lead attacker's throat hard enough to drop him gasping, and used the man's own falling weight to yank a short blade free from his grip before the second attacker could close the gap. The 2 Kaelen guards fought beside him with the fast, brutal efficiency of their hereditary training, and for the first 90 seconds, Nathaniel genuinely believed the 3 of them might hold the doorway long enough for the 11-minute reinforcement window to close in their favor. The attackers had planned for exactly that assumption. A concussive charge, small, professional, detonated against the doorframe's outer edge, put all 3 defenders off their feet in a single violent instant, Nathaniel's ears ringing, his vision swimming, a fresh gash opening along his hairline where he'd clipped the doorframe on the way down. He tasted blood and dust and heard, through the ringing, the senior guard's voice cut off mid-shout as a second wave of attackers pushed through the smoke. He came up fighting on instinct alone, blade still gripped in one hand, and found the senior guard down, a blade wound opening dark across his side, still conscious but clearly not fighting capable anymore. The second guard was pinned against the far wall, holding 2 attackers at a standstill through sheer trained ferocity, buying seconds rather than minutes. Elira herself, Nathaniel registered with a cold spike of professional alarm, was no longer visible in the room at all, and for one terrible half-second he thought the worst, before he caught the telltale scrape of dust-covered stone shifting behind the north wall's paneling and understood, with a wash of relief he didn't have time to fully feel, that she'd done exactly what he'd told her to do the moment the fighting started, got into the service passage and started moving. "Go," he shouted to the wounded senior guard, hauling him bodily toward the same gap in the paneling. "Passage behind the wall, narrow enough only one of them can follow at a time. Move." The passage. The old service passage was barely wide enough for a single body to move through without turning sideways, thick with decades of undisturbed dust that caught in Nathaniel's throat and stung in the fresh cut along his hairline, lit only by the dim, intermittent glow of failing emergency strips embedded in the ceiling every few meters. It ran the length of the wing, connecting, as he'd catalogued on day one, to an old maintenance stairwell that predated the palace's current security architecture entirely. Invisible to modern sensors, absent from modern floor plans, exactly the kind of forgotten infrastructure that a professional assassination team, working off current schematics stolen or purchased from somewhere, would have no way of anticipating. It also meant, crucially, that only one attacker could follow them through the gap at a time, turning a 6-on-3 ambush back into something closer to the one-on-one exchanges Nathaniel had built his entire career around surviving. He held the rear of the group as they moved Elira ahead, moving fast and low with the composed, practiced calm of someone who had clearly rehearsed emergency evacuation drills more times in her life than she'd ever wanted to. The wounded senior guard half-carried between her and his partner, and Nathaniel bringing up the rear with a stolen blade and a body that was starting, in the adrenaline's ebbing aftermath, to register just how much the concussive blast and the fight afterward had actually cost him. The first attacker to squeeze through the gap behind them did not survive the encounter. Nathaniel met him in the narrow dark with the flat, economical brutality of 11 years, spent training for exactly this kind of confined, close-quarters violence, using the passage's own width against an opponent who had no room to bring his longer reach to bear. It cost Nathaniel a shallow cut along his forearm and a solid, ringing blow to the ribs that stole his breath for several seconds afterward, but it bought the group another 30 meters of distance before the second attacker came through. "You're bleeding," Elira said, glancing back at him during a brief pause where the passage widened enough for the group to catch its breath, her voice tight with something that wasn't quite the flat command register she'd used since the attack began. "Occupational hazard," Nathaniel said, pressing a hand against the wound at his ribs, breathing shallow around what he suspected, with grim professional detachment, was at least one cracked rib. "Keep moving. We stop, they catch up, and this passage stops being an advantage the second more than one of them gets a clean line on us at once." She kept moving. The second attacker who found them in a tighter stretch of the passage some 60 meters further on proved considerably more dangerous than the first, faster, better trained, clearly aware by now that the group ahead of him had already killed one of his team, and adjusting his approach accordingly, probing rather than charging, looking for the gap in Nathaniel's guard the way a professional looks for exactly that kind of gap. Nathaniel found it first, using the same trick that had gotten him through 11 years of protection work against opponents who outmatched him physically. He let the fight slow down instead of speeding up, forcing his attacker into a patient, probing exchange in a space too cramped for either of them to fully commit to a killing strike, buying time rather than spending it, right up until the moment the attacker's own patience ran thinner than his, and he overextended a strike Nathaniel had spent the last 90 seconds specifically baiting him into. It ended the fight, but not cleanly. Nathaniel took a shallow blade wound across his shoulder in the same exchange that put his opponent down, and by the time the passage's dim emergency lighting showed the maintenance stairwell ahead, he was moving on adrenaline and stubbornness in roughly equal measure, blood soaking through his shirt from two separate wounds, his cracked rib grinding with every breath. A bigger plan than a kill team. The maintenance stairwell led down, eventually, to a service door that opened onto the palace's old kitchen gardens. A stretch of open, moonlit ground that Nathaniel's professional instincts immediately flagged as dangerous exposure rather than safety, and he held the group back at the doorway rather than pushing straight out into it. "Something's wrong," he said, breathing hard, pressing his good hand against the doorframe to steady himself. This was too easy. 6 attackers, planned entry, professional equipment, and the moment we go off-script through a passage they couldn't have anticipated, we just walk clean out into open ground without a single additional contact. That's not incompetence. That's a team that had a second plan ready for exactly this contingency. Elira's expression, already tight with the strain of the last 20 minutes, went a shade paler. "You think they anticipated we might use an alternate route?" "I think a team professional enough to blind palace security and time an attack around your father's council rotation didn't build a plan with only one path to success," Nathaniel said. "Which means somewhere between here and any actual safety, there's a second team, and this garden's about the most exposed ground on the whole palace grounds to walk into blind." He was right. The calm bead at his collar, silent since the initial blast had disrupted the wing's relay, crackled abruptly back to life, with a fragmented, urgent transmission from the palace's own security office. A second, larger force had been detected breaching the palace's outer perimeter near the kitchen gardens roughly 6 minutes earlier. Timed, the fragmented report suggested, to intercept exactly the kind of emergency evacuation route the princess's detail would most likely use if the primary assault team failed to secure her directly. "This isn't a kill team," Nathaniel said, the full shape of the operation clicking into place with the cold, unwelcome clarity of a puzzle he wished he hadn't solved. "It's an extraction. Somebody wants her alive, wants her taken rather than killed outright, and they built 2 teams specifically to cover both the direct approach and the fallback route, because a captured princess is worth infinitely more to whoever's behind this than a dead one. Political leverage. A hostage claim on the throne itself, maybe, depending who's backing this." "My uncle," Elira said, quiet, the color draining further from her face as several separate pieces of court politics she'd clearly been quietly worrying over for months suddenly aligned into a single, coherent threat. "He has contested my father's succession claim for years through legal channels and lost every time. If I am captured rather than killed, he gains a hostage to force a regency crisis, and a claim to the throne my father could never legally refuse without risking my life directly." "Then we don't go through the garden," Nathaniel said, already thinking through the palace's layout again, running every alternate route he'd cataloged in 6 weeks being underestimated by exactly the guard corps now bleeding on the floor above them. "We need somewhere defensible, somewhere the second team won't expect, and long enough to buy real reinforcements time to actually arrive instead of running into an ambush 11 minutes too early." The chapel. The old palace chapel, disused for formal worship for at least 2 generations but kept intact out of ceremonial tradition, sat at the edge of the kitchen gardens in a squat, heavy-stoned building, with exactly one working entrance and walls thick enough to have survived 3 centuries of weather without so much as a structural crack. Nathaniel had cataloged it on day 3 of his posting, purely out of habit, purely because 11 years of protection work had taught him that the most useful piece of information you could have about any building was which single room in it offered the fewest ways in, and the most ways to make an attacker regret trying. "It's not on any modern security overlay," he said, half carrying the wounded senior guard through the chapel's heavy door, while Elira and the second guard covered their approach across the exposed garden ground at a dead sprint. "Which means it's not on the second team's plan either, same as the service passage. One door, thick walls, and a bell tower with a clear line on the only approach. If they want her, they have to come through a choke point I get to choose. Instead of open ground they get to choose." The chapel's interior was cold, dim, smelling faintly of centuries-old incense and dust undisturbed by regular use. Moonlight filtering weakly through narrow stained glass windows too small for anyone to use as an entry point. Nathaniel got the wounded guard settled against the base of the old stone altar, pressed a hand briefly to the man's side to check the bleeding had slowed rather than worsened, and turned to the room's single heavy door, already thinking through exactly how he intended to make it a problem for anyone trying to come through it. "How long until reinforcements actually reach us here?" Elira asked, her voice steadier now than it had been in the garden, the flat, practiced calm of a woman used to crisis reasserting itself now that she had a moment to think rather than simply run. "Depends how fast the security office can update their maps once I tell them where we actually are," Nathaniel said, already working the heavy door's old iron bar down into its bracket, sealing it the way it had presumably been sealed 100 times a century ago against weather rather than assassins. "Which I'm about to do right now, along with everything else useful I know about this building that isn't on their current schematics." The turn. The second team found the chapel 12 minutes later, fewer numbers than the first assault, but better equipped, moving with the unhurried confidence of a force that had clearly expected this to be the easy half of the operation, mopping up a target that should already have been secured by the primary team's failure elsewhere on the grounds. They did not expect the chapel's single door to be barred from the inside by a man who had spent his very first week on this posting, cataloging exactly how old, thick, and stubborn that door actually was. The first attempt at forcing entry cost the attackers precious minutes and gained them nothing. The old iron bar held far better than modern security architecture would have predicted, because nobody in the current era had bothered rating a 3-century-old door's actual structural resilience against a threat model built entirely around modern breach equipment tuned for modern doors. By the time they shifted tactics, working instead toward one of the chapel's narrow stained glass windows in a slower, more methodical breach attempt, Nathaniel had used the borrowed minutes to do exactly what 11 years of protection work had trained him to do under pressure: turn a defensive stand into an active trap instead of a passive wait. He'd found in the chapel's old sacristy a stock of heavy ceremonial candlesticks, ornamental but genuinely solid brass, along with several coils of thick, ancient bell rope still connected to the tower above, and a small store of consecrated oil kept, per old tradition, for ceremonies nobody performed anymore. "You intend to fight them with candlesticks and rope," Elira said, watching him work with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and the beginning of something that looked, for the first time since they'd met, like genuine trust rather than tolerance. "I intend to make sure whoever comes through that window regrets it before they get a clean shot at you," Nathaniel said, rigging the bell rope into a taut line across the chapel's narrow side passage at ankle height, dim enough in the moonlight to be nearly invisible, positioned exactly where an attacker's own momentum, coming through a cramped window breach, would carry them straight into it. D building, old tricks. Nobody plans a modern assault around candlesticks and consecrated oil, which is exactly why it might actually work. The stained glass window gave way 8 minutes later, and the first attacker threw, it hit the rigged bell rope at a dead run, pitching forward hard into the stone floor with enough force to crack visibly against the flagstones, and Nathaniel closed the distance before the man could fully recover, a heavy brass candlestick doing in his hand what a proper weapon would have done more cleanly, but no less effectively. It cost him. The second attacker through the window, more cautious after watching his partner go down, landed a solid, glancing blow across Nathaniel's already wounded shoulder that dropped him hard against the altar's stone edge, fresh pain lancing bright and immediate through the earlier blade wound. He came up anyway, because 11 years of this work had taught him, the same way 11 months of captivity had once taught a very different man on a very different world, that staying down in the middle of an active threat was its own kind of decision, and not one he'd made yet. He won the exchange not through strength. He didn't have the strength left for that, not against a trained combatant with two working shoulders against his one, but through the same principle that had gotten him through 11 years of soft target protection work. Use the environment, use the moment your opponent isn't expecting, and never, ever fight fair when fighting fair meant losing. He grabbed a fistful of the consecrated oil stone jar from the sacristy shelf beside him and flung its contents directly into his opponent's eyes, buying a half-second of pure, disoriented blindness that was all he needed to close the last of the distance, and put the man down hard against the same stone floor his partner already occupied. A question of command. The chapel went quiet, briefly, in the aftermath, 2 attackers down, 1 wounded senior guard stable against the altar. Elira pressed protectively but steadily against the wall where Nathaniel had positioned her at the fight's start, watching the whole exchange with an expression that had shed every last trace of the skeptical tolerance she'd carried since his very first day on this posting. The quiet didn't last. A third voice called out from beyond the broken window, calm, measured, clearly the operation's actual commander rather than another foot soldier, and the words that followed made clear the night's real complication had not yet fully arrived. "You have fought well, human," the voice said, in accented but clear coalition standard, deliberately chosen, Nathaniel suspected, to make sure he understood every word without translation lag. "Better than my intelligence suggested a hired contractor would manage. This changes nothing regarding the outcome, only its cost. I have 12 additional soldiers positioned around this building, and reinforcements from your own security office are, I assure you, considerably further away than the palace's own compromised internal comms have led you to believe. Surrender the princess, and the rest of you may yet see morning." "Compromised comms," Nathaniel repeated, low to Elira, the shape of the operation's real scope settling over him with cold, professional clarity. "That's why the reinforcement timelines felt off since the first blast. Somebody inside the palace's own security office is feeding this operation false status updates. My uncle has allies inside the Guard administration," Elira said, quiet, furious, the pieces continuing to click into place with the particular bitterness of realizing exactly how deep a betrayal actually ran. "It would not be the first time his faction bought loyalty inside my father's own household. If they have compromised the comms relay, no reinforcement estimate we've received tonight can be trusted at all." Nathaniel looked around the chapel, 1 working exit now compromised by a broken window, 2 guards down or wounded, a commander outside with a dozen soldiers and no reason at all to negotiate honestly, and did the same flat, practical math he'd been doing all night. Straight combat against 12 professional soldiers was not survivable. It had never been survivable, not for three exhausted, wounded defenders and a princess with no weapons training of her own. Winning this, if it was winnable at all, was not going to come from anyone's fists. "I need everything you know about this chapel's actual construction," he said to Elira, low and fast. "Not the ceremonial history, the physical building. Old palaces like this one, 3 centuries old, they weren't just built for worship. Buildings this old on contested thrones usually had a second purpose baked into the architecture, whether anyone remembers it now or not." Elira's eyes widened slightly, some old, half-forgotten piece of childhood knowledge surfacing under the pressure of the moment. "There is a crypt," she said, "beneath the altar. My grandmother told me stories as a child. This chapel was built during a succession war, 5 generations back, specifically with an escape tunnel running from the crypt out beyond the palace's original perimeter wall, in case a contested heir ever needed to disappear rather than be captured during exactly this kind of crisis. I always assumed it was a child's tale. I never confirmed it was real." "Only one way to find out," Nathaniel said, already moving toward the altar, running his hands along its base with the same methodical, professional thoroughness that had found the service passage 6 weeks earlier out of nothing but habit. "And if it's real, it's exactly the kind of thing that compromised comms and modern threat assessments would have no way of knowing about at all. The crypt." It took nearly 4 of their remaining minutes to find the mechanism. A section of the altar's stone base that gave, under enough combined pressure, with a grinding, dust-choked reluctance that told Nathaniel it hadn't been used in longer than anyone currently alive had been born. Beneath it, a narrow stone stairwell descended into darkness, thick with the particular cold, still air of a space that had been sealed away from the world for generations. "This is either exactly what we need," Nathaniel said, working a small emergency light free from his belt kit, "or it's a dead end 5 generations old that collapsed decades ago, and we've just trapped ourselves somewhere 12 armed soldiers can dig us out of at their leisure. Only one way to know which." It was, against every reasonable expectation for a passage that old, still intact, narrow, cold, thick with undisturbed dust, but structurally sound, running in a straight, deliberate line beneath the chapel floor toward what Elira's half-remembered childhood story had promised would be an exit beyond the palace's original perimeter wall. Getting the wounded senior guard down the narrow stairwell cost precious minutes and no small amount of pain on his part. But by the time the commander's voice outside the chapel escalated from patient negotiation into the harder edge of a man realizing his target, had gone quiet for longer than any negotiation should reasonably take. The group was already moving through 5 generations of undisturbed dark, toward an exit no modern threat assessment had any way of anticipating. They emerged, nearly 10 minutes later, into a stretch of overgrown, long-forgotten garden well beyond the palace's current perimeter, invisible to the modern security grid because it had simply never been included in it. The old original wall crumbled enough in one section to let them climb through into open, moonlit ground considerably further from any hostile forces' planned intercept points than either assault team could have accounted for. It was there, finally, catching his breath against a section of ancient, ivy-choked stone wall with blood drying across 2 separate wounds, and a cracked rib grinding with every gasp, that Nathaniel got his comm bead to connect, at last, to a security channel that hadn't been compromised, a backup frequency, reserved for exactly this kind of catastrophic primary failure, that he'd made a point of memorizing on his very first week, out of the same habitual thoroughness that had, by his own rough count, saved all their lives at least 3 separate times over the course of one impossible night. Dawn. The palace's actual, Uncompromised reinforcement force arrived within 9 minutes of that call, a detachment personally led. It would turn out, by the king himself, who had been woken by the very first fragmented alert before the comms compromise fully took hold, and who had spent the intervening hour organizing a response built on the assumption that his daughter's usual detail could not be fully trusted to reach him with accurate information. The 12 soldiers surrounding the now empty chapel were captured within the hour, their commander among them, and the trail from his interrogation, conducted, Nathaniel would learn later, with considerably more urgency than diplomacy, led directly, exactly as Elira had predicted, back to a faction loyal to her uncle's long-contested succession claim, along with confirmation of at least 2 compromised officials inside the palace's own security administration. Nathaniel sat on the low garden wall as the sun came up properly over the palace grounds, a medic working steadily at the wound across his shoulder, while another checked the wounded senior guard nearby, and watched Captain Vessa Thren approach across the dew-wet grass with an expression that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the dismissive contempt she'd worn 6 weeks earlier on his very first day. 2 of my own guards are alive tonight because of a passage you found in your first week on this posting, she said, stopping in front of him, her voice carefully controlled in the way someone forcing herself through words she wasn't accustomed to saying. A crypt escape route none of us, none of my corps, across 11 generations of service to this throne, had any knowledge even existed. I called you furniture with a pulse in front of my own men on your first day. You did, Nathaniel agreed, not unkindly, wincing as the medic tightened a bandage. Wasn't the worst thing I've been called on a job. Won't be the last either. I was wrong, Thren said plainly, without the softening most people reached for when admitting something like that. I judged you on pedigree instead of competence, the same mistake my order has made about your species since the first treaty was signed. I do not enjoy being wrong. I enjoy considerably less the fact that it took an assassination attempt on the crown's own heir to correct it. Then let's make sure it sticks past this morning, Nathaniel said, because I've got 5 more weeks on this contract, and I'd genuinely rather spend them working with your corps than around it. After, Elira found him a while later, once the worst of the medical attention had settled into the kind of routine follow-up that no longer required his full attention, sitting quietly at the garden's edge with the morning light finally warm enough to feel good against skin that had spent most of the night cold with adrenaline and blood loss. You saved my life 3 separate times tonight, she said, sitting down beside him without waiting for an invitation, something in her bearing looser now than it had been in 6 full weeks of careful, guarded professionalism. The service passage, the chapel door, the crypt. My own guard corps, for all their pedigree, would have walked me straight into whichever ambush the compromised comms steered us toward. Wasn't luck, Nathaniel said. Wasn't even really skill, most of it. Just habit. First week on any job, I catalog every exit, every weak point, every piece of a building nobody bothered updating on the official records. 9 times out of 10, nobody ever needs any of it. Tonight happened to be the 10th time. My father wishes to formally commend you before the full court, she said. My uncle's faction will answer for tonight in a manner considerably more public and considerably less forgiving than his previous legal challenges ever risked. And my own guard corps, Captain Thren informs me, intends to submit a formal review of its training protocols regarding hired specialists, human or otherwise, going forward. Good, Nathaniel said. Long as the review doesn't involve any more standing outside doors listening to guys assume I can't follow their own language. 6 weeks of that got old fast. Elira laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the first one he'd heard from her in 6 full weeks of careful professional distance. And for a moment the exhaustion and fear of the night before seemed to lift genuinely off her shoulders, rather than simply being suppressed underneath practiced royal composure. "I will see to it personally," she said, "that no one in this palace ever again refers to you as furniture." "Appreciated," Nathaniel said, closing his eyes against the warm morning light, letting himself finally, properly relax for the first time in 6 weeks. "In the meantime, I could go for actual breakfast instead of another cold ration bar. Almost dying tends to work up an appetite." "That," Elira said, standing and offering him a hand up with a small, genuine smile, "I believe this entire palace owes you without argument." If you liked watching a hired human bodyguard turn 6 weeks of being underestimated into the exact reason a princess survived an assassination attempt, hit like and subscribe for more stories where humanity earns its respect the hard way. Drop a comment telling me whether you think Captain Thren's Guard Corps deserved a second chance after tonight, and share this one with the person in your life who always notices the exit nobody else bothered to check. See you in the next one.